Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Kate and Matt, for joining, and thank you for the attendees on the line on taking the time on a Thursday to come and know more around CAF, what's happening in the great land of Microsoft Azure, and how we as Contino have been partnering and working with Microsoft. So today's webinar is going to be around Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework and some of the great work that's been done within that space recently within the last 6 to 9 months, and how we as Contino have seen that evolved and contributed to the success of that with our client base. You'll be good to know that throughout the entirety of the session, it won't just be my monotonous voice that you'll be hearing, and I've got two fantastic presenters with myself on the line, Kate and Matt. Kate and Matt, did you want to do an introduction of yourselves before I presented who I was?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I'm Kate McCarthy. I work in what we call our Azure business group here at Microsoft. So I am a product manager for our enable strategy, so which is largely based off CAF, but helping customers be successful in the cloud and everything to do with that. I kind of work with both our partners and our internal teams and our customers on making sure that that's happening.
Sure, thanks, Kate. And for those of you who can't see Kate on the webinar, her avatar apparently is a very accurate representation of who she is. So all good there. Matt, did you want to give a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Matthew Higham. I'm the Chief Digital Officer for Microsoft UK. So I work across all of our customers in all of our sectors in the enterprise space. And I've got a huge passion for DevOps and what it brings and the CAF program. So yeah, really glad to be here today.
Cheers, thanks, Matt. And hello all, Deepak Vensi, co-host for the session today. So I'm an account principal and transformation director at Contino. So I specialize in working with some of our more complex clients, primarily within the financial services sector, from which a lot of the work done around CAF has actually learned and been inspired from, in order to help them adopt modern engineering practices all the way from DevOps, site reliability engineering, and GitOps, and help them adopt Azure in a secure and reliable fashion. So hopefully, across the expertise that all Kate, Matt, and myself have today, we'll be able to give you a pretty meaningful and spicy discussion for how to adopt CAF at scale within the enterprise. So just to give you a flavor of what you can expect today, we'll give you a brief context of what we've seen within the industry sort of in the last 12 to 6 months, some of the key drivers and trends that organizations are looking to challenge when looking to adopt cloud. What is Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework and how that's helped overcome those challenges that organizations are seeing. We'll then give you a brief flavor into Contino's methodology and how that adapts to what CAF looks to achieve and offer to the wider client base out there who want to adapt Azure, and certain accelerators and blueprints you can look out for from Contino and how they adapt to the wider Microsoft framework in order to kickstart your Azure adoption. And do stick around to the end where we'll point out to certain key resources and next steps that you can all look out for when looking to get started with CAF. The session, there will be an opportunity to do Q&A, so you should all have the ability to type those in a Q&A box that you might have on the screen. And I'll have the questions panel open all the time, so as and when they come through, I'll make sure I can redirect that to any one of the three presenters who you have on the call today. So just a bit around Contino. I'm not going to keep this as a massive sales pitch, but for those of you who might not have known us, we've been an established partner within the enterprise cloud adoption and DevOps space for the last 4 to 5 years. We are a global organization spanning across EMEA, the States, and APAC, with a Contini base of more than 350 people, and we are a Microsoft Go partner. So we specialize in all things cloud adoption, enterprise DevOps, cloud native platforms, data platforms, and cloud native software engineering. And a lot of the work and a lot of the expertise and sort of blueprints that will be showcased today on screen is based on the more than 450 engagements that we've done with across anyone more than 200 to 300 clients. So a lot of the stuff that you will see on screen today is based on the lessons learned, both from a Microsoft recommendation standpoint as well as what we as Contino have seen evolve within the industry. So just a bit of context, right? So when we're looking at consuming cloud at scale, whilst trying to do small POCs and proof of concept is all great, but cloud at scale is a completely different beast, right? No longer are we just talking about build me a landing zone. No longer are we just talking about how can I consume Azure reliably and securely, but actually we're talking about a lot of challenges across the entire organization in the C-suite. So if you are a CTO, the key challenge that you would be concerned about is actually what are the core cloud foundations that I need to put in place. If you are someone who looks after the operational side of the platform, you'll be considered around the BAU processes that you need to put in place in order to adopt cloud at scale. If you might be someone who's head of product, your concern might be the developer experience and the enablement that you can offer out to your SMEs in order to adopt cloud in the right way. And if you might be, say, someone like the CFO, you might care about financial agility and financial control and FinOps and how can you adopt that as a process. So safe to say cloud adoption is more than just a technical challenge, especially when we're looking at it at enterprise scale. And the CAF framework is there to help you navigate those challenges and how you can help solve that. But before we sort of go into some of the details of CAF, Matt, I'd be interested to hear, sort of what are some of the challenges that you see given the role that you have to play within Microsoft, and what are some of the challenges that you see when you're speaking to the C-suite?
Yeah, I think there's a bow wave of change happening at that C-suite level. They're all having to suddenly become incredibly digitally aware and more tech savvy. They are struggling on that journey often, and understanding how they can transition from a legacy debt, obviously, which is where they currently sit, and erode that debt whilst at the same time trying to drive innovation, both to themselves and also into the market, because it's becoming much more competitive. Cloud at scale is seen as an opportunity for that, but it's really that translation between the business outcome and the kind of the technology and what it means from cloud at scale. And that's where I spend a lot of my time, is kind of talking to those individuals, educating them, bringing them up to speed, and understanding their challenges. As you already touched on, people like the CFO are the first person I usually go and have a chat with, because they're the ones most fearful. How do I control cost? How do I move from a very CapEx orientated organization into an OpEx orientated organization? CTOs tend to get it, but they're all about innovation and trying to push the boundaries of this, and how do they leverage that. The CIO is trying to hold on to keeping the lights on, right? And he's about to transition potentially most of his responsibility around SLAs, securities, and support into the hands of a cloud provider, and that can be quite scary and daunting for those kind of individuals. So those are the conversations across the organization that we tend to see.
And I guess from a Microsoft standpoint, Matt, how do you see Microsoft looking to sort of address some of these challenges when considering sort of cloud and digital adoption at that level?
There's two things. One is trust, and we're going to probably touch on that throughout this conversation today. I think handing over the kind of keys to the castle essentially is got to be to a partner that is trusted in every way. We're lucky in the sense, I think, partly in a sense, but also can be a negative sometimes. But we grew up in the enterprise. We grew up with that enterprise rigidity and support framework and security, and the amount of money and investment that we pump into that gives us that level of trust with our customers, hopefully. Or it definitely comes back in the conversation that we have.
No, I've certainly I think touching upon the great heritage and the great insights that Microsoft has around the enterprise scale within an organization's on-premise environments perhaps is certainly quite critical, right? Especially when we look into aspects such as Active Directory, SQL, Windows, etc. That certainly is a large part of what an enterprise looks to do, right? And I guess if we were to sort of take some of these challenges and focus them towards the actual business outcomes that organizations are trying to deliver, all the way from things like retail, things like financial services, public sector, healthcare. Safe to say there are a fair amount of drivers, and depending on the maturity of an organization, those drivers can primarily be classified into either enterprise challenges that they might be looking to address, which is more customer facing. They might have regulatory demands coming in from the outside in that they have to adhere to, or they might just have to make sure they've got the right technology enablers, right, in order to make sure they can remain competitive as a business. So safe to say, when considering cloud adoption at scale, an organization really does have to think, well, what are the drivers that I am trying to solve as part of that, right? If you're in the retail sector, it could just be you're trying to re-envision how your in-store and digital customer experience works. Whereas perhaps if you're in the, let's say if you're in the utilities and energy sector, your focus is more on smart cities and cleaner sources of energy, right? Which could be a challenge as an entire organization. You're starting to question, what do we as a business start to do? Whilst on the other hand, if you feel those elements you have quite well covered, but you haven't got the foundations in place to help you solve that, it could be perhaps that you want to consider, and especially with all things COVID-19 right now, it's quite topical when organizations are looking into things like digital contact centers to re-envision completely how they offer customer service as an outcome to their clients. Or perhaps, again, quite a topical topic that's going on right now is how can you adhere to digital health technology standards to better leverage the data that is being that is available to these organizations to consume, right? And in the press, there's been a lot of discussion around how the UK, for instance, has been dealing with the Trace and Tracking app. But all of these are things that have to be considered when you're looking to build out your framework around cloud adoption. I guess from your standpoint, Matt, I'll be keen to understand, based on some of these industry drivers and challenges, there's been a fair amount of work that Microsoft has done around aligning industry sectors to how Azure works, and for instance, Azure for retail, Azure for energy. You know, how do you see some of that sort of evolving in order to further foster a sense of innovation within that space?
Yeah, it's absolutely imperative that we get much closer to the business outcomes and the industry outcomes and the market demand outcomes as well with regards to this. So we work heavily with both our customers, but also their regulators. So in the utility space, we work with those with the regulators to help them understand what it means and the innovation and the benefit to the end consumer of adopting cloud technologies and edge compute, IoT, predictive maintenance, all that kind of great stuff. We're heavily embedded, and even with yourselves, we've helped influence the financial regulation market of how to adopt cloud in the best practice way. We work with governments on a global scale to help them write their digital strategies as an agnostic view to the technology that underpins it, but ultimately helps them adopt and drive policy, which allows them to be able to release the benefit to citizens and to consumers alike across that. That's the real kind of leading edge. You can't have innovation without having to an understanding of how you would deploy it at scale. And that's exactly where we want to be and where we want to continue to play.
Yeah, and I guess with all of these aspects that you mentioned, Matt, so you've got the regulators, you've got your technology providers, you've got your partners who can help you do that. So to say organizations have to move towards a position where you're starting to build your own internal capability that's capable of triaging all of this and making the best of what they have to do within their space. And I think that's where I do love using this quote from Satya, right, from Microsoft, and the fact that every organization has to build their own tech intensity, right? You certainly don't want to be in a position where you're building technology for technology's sake and rebuilding the same time and time again. You very much do want to be in a position where, in effect, your underlying technology is basically a commodity, and we'll talk about more later today how CAF helps you do that in making sure your underlying cloud is just something you can just go and use, whilst you're focusing the bulk of your time at being at the forefront of what your business is looking to deliver. But that can only happen if you've got the right approach to technology adoption, you've done the right thing in building your own internal capability, but you've also got that aspect of trust that you talked about, trust in the platform, trust in the cloud provider. I'd love to hear from your standpoint, Matt. You know, what do you see the role Microsoft playing when looking to build one's own tech intensity?
Well, I think CAF is a beautiful starting point. Right? It's the ability to be able to build that landing zone and the operational foundations for you to be able to start to compute, really start to innovate in that compute space. With trust and knowledge that you can open that up to your own business almost as a self-service capability. I think moving on from there, the trick for me is, and I have this conversation at board levels across a number of organizations, is everybody thinks they're special, everybody thinks what they do is unique. When in actual reality, between 65% and kind of 80% of all organizations are roughly the same. But you want to be focusing on that USP that makes them the speciality in the market, or the driver in that market and the innovator. But they spend a lot of time actually just reinventing the wheel. And that's where we can take that pain away. And then they can pivot their specialism and their capability of their organization into really driving that change and transformation in the market and for themselves and everything else. And that's where we want to be playing with them as well, and supporting them on that journey.
That's a fair point, Matt. You know, I think that the aspect around every customer thinks they're special is certainly, I think we've all been in that position. And whilst I know, you know, we've been bouncing some discussions back and forth, and we've mentioned CAF a couple of times now, but I'm conscious for the audience, we haven't actually covered what CAF is. So, Kate, given that we've got you on the line, how about you walk us through actually what is Microsoft CAF, right? And all these discussions and so we've been having around tech intensity, around the industry drivers, around how can organizations basically make technology as a commodity for them and focus on the industry challenges. What is Microsoft CAF and how does it help enable organizations to do that?
Yeah, so CAF is short for the Cloud Adoption Framework. We love a good acronym at Microsoft. But the Cloud Adoption Framework is Microsoft's approach to adopting the cloud, really. We have consolidated all of our best practices and guidance to be able to help people on that journey. We've collated the information from employees, partners, and customers, and I'm being really boastful here. We have a lot of knowledge about how to help people on that cloud journey. And if you flip to the next slide, it's not good just sitting with us. There's no use in us in just holding this kind of wealth of information. So the Cloud Adoption Framework is how we're able to surface that knowledge and guidance and provide people with that best practice. Every organization will use the Cloud Adoption Framework differently, but the framework itself includes a set of tools, guidance, narratives from experiences that have happened that can help organizations shape that technology, but also the people and processes to help with the strategies and outcomes that they want to work with as an organization. We recognize a lot of organizations are trying to achieve rapid change. A lot of organizations have really strong kind of business objectives. CAF is about helping how we change how businesses do business. It's not just swapping out different technologies, but it's changing the way that we kind of do enterprise or organizations. It's the culture behind it. And so it's about aligning the business people and technology, as we said, and that strategy. And I think what you said before was really core, that it really is underpinned by what motivations and what outcomes you're looking for. It's about achieving those business goals with actionable, efficient, and comprehensive guidance to give you the trust that this has been a method, or this has been a learning that other people have been through, and we can learn through that. And then delivering results, but not just delivering results, because too much change and too little change. It's a really neat balance of how do we keep the control and stability of our core business, but also rapidly adapt and get that speed and see those results. So the Cloud Adoption Framework is all of our learnings and practices and best guidance to help people start to be able to make those core changes. So if we're flipping to the next slide, it's not a tool, it's an iterative process that supports businesses as it evolves. So the expectation is actually this should be an embedded process in all that organizations do. It should be something that's constantly revisited. And as you can see right in the middle, it's about defining that strategy for the organization. So it starts with a vision for businesses. crystallizing that vision and talking about cross-functionality. You know, what is finance trying to achieve with moving to the cloud? What are marketing and sales and HR departments trying to achieve? Because joining those conversations together is really critical to having that end-to-end business success when we try to make some of these changes. Clear motivations, and we talked about the motivations before. Is it regulatory motivations? Is it industry motivations? Why are we adopting the cloud? And defining that business justification for that move is really, really core to this process, because then we start to build the plan, we start to build how we get ready, which is largely around that landing zone. How do we adopt the technologies? And then that governance and management. So flipping to the next slide, whilst it is that iterative process and it's very cyclical, the way that we kind of look at it in steps, I guess, is defining that strategy. So as we just talked about, being really crystal clear on, there's no point just moving to the cloud for the sake of moving to the cloud. What is your business aiming to achieve with this? And I think that's really core with what we're going through in the market at the moment. COVID has made some rapid changes to where we find ourselves, and looking at what expected outcomes are we hoping to achieve. Critically, planning. And I think this is not just planning to say, okay, cool, this is our timeline. This is planning what additional skills is your organization going to need? You know, what different culture components are you going to have to look at? How does your organization currently function, and what kind of different, I guess, bringing everyone onto the same page is needed to make this really, really successful. And that adoption plan is critical in how you're moving to the cloud. The ready phase is also is about preparing the people, process, environment. So this is where we hear this term landing zone quite a lot, and I know that we will talk about that a little bit further. But what is the optimal cloud environment across all of those components? So not just your plumbing and your electricity supply to your city, but what other pieces in the organization do you really have to focus on to make sure that you're ready for either a defined project or an all-in cloud move? And the one thing that it's probably worth saying is that this doesn't have to be used for why move to the cloud. It can be a project by project base. You know, each time you're going to have to define the strategy of why you're taking on that project and plan for it appropriately. But this guidance tries to help. What are some of the things that we should be thinking about? And then moving to the adopt, which is largely the way we see it is we see two real functions of how people are moving to the cloud, and that's the migration of previous infrastructure or workloads, and then also the innovation, which is really transforming your business. Completely underpinned by governance and management, because there is just absolutely no way that we can have that successful cloud usage if we're not thinking about how do we stay compliant, how do we make sure we're in control of our environment, and how do we make sure things are secure. Now more than ever, that security aspect needs to be built into the full conversations, and also underpinned by a level of management. So how are we operating our business, but optimizing? And optimizing is so key for where we are, and continual optimization. So that's just not optimization of let's take a bunch of cost out of our organization. It's how do we run lean and efficient environments that are, working in the best way for our organization. So CAF is really broad, but it also can be quite specific to helping you be able to look at some of the tools and processes to think about when we're talking about that cloud journey. And using that proven guidance to accelerate those projects that you might have within your organization. So that is, and there's a wealth of knowledge. There's almost a Lord of the Rings trilogy per part in terms of the amount of information that we've put out there. Obviously, don't go reading it all at bedtime, but for people that want to kind of get into it, there's levels, there's intensity levels of how deep and how kind of high you can go to the information that you're looking, and that guidance that you're looking for with Microsoft. But then as we know, partners are building this into everyday practices and have really strong capabilities in this space, and it's entirely underpinned by the partners that we work with to make sure that this is helping within our customer base.
Wow, that was some walkthrough about CAF, Kate. I mean, it's great to hear sort of how it's sort of built across the years and months, right? Based on the experience, as you said, that Microsoft themselves had, but also from partners as well as customers. I mean, I'd love to get sort of a take from your side, and Matt, I'd love to hear if you've got any thoughts around and how you've sort of seen Azure adoption almost evolve from your client base sort of in the last 12 to 24 months as the CAF framework has matured and as that guidance towards customers has increased. How have you seen Azure consumption change and adopt over time?
Yeah, I think for me, being quite honest, I think CAF has always existed in the way that we do work with anyone, and I think it's always been an underpinning kind of journey. However, I think it's become more documented and streamlined to help with what we've learnt works and what we've learnt definitely doesn't work. And so if I think about customers where we were talking, we've always kind of talked around that migrate and innovate, that adoption phase, and I think there's a really strong kind of focus on that. But I think what we forget is that there's a build up to making sure that that's really, really successful. And I'd say the shift that I've seen is that people are starting to think about, what new skills do I need to bring into my organization? What organizational changes, what cultural changes do I have to make? And I think that's a different level of conversation that we're seeing as customers completely reinvent the way that their business is functioning. It has to take on that new model. I think there's a broader conversation about taking some of those steps and to talk about some of those changes. That's the large shift that I've seen. Matthew, anything from you?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kate, about it's kind of always been there, but now this is about democratizing it, making it simpler to adopt, making it more rapid to adopt. Our customers' demand on agility and speed and pace and continuous pace has driven this, and that's exactly what we've done. We've listened, we've learned, we've taken a wealth of knowledge and we've put it into a mechanism and pushed it out to our partners as well to facilitate that. So it just makes that onboarding process and transitioning from an old SIAM kind of ITSM, ITIL-based Prince2 EA-focused world into moving into this world can be very, very daunting for both IT and the business. So hopefully this has eased it. I think more so now than ever in COVID. I mean, obviously we've seen an enormous demand profile increase for Azure over the last 12 weeks, something in the realms of 775%. I think we published very recently, and that's just for Azure, not to mention all of the other technologies that we kind of think. There's a lot of Xbox users out there now, shall we say? But this has become so much more important for that. So speed and agility to be able to launch, deploy, secure, trusted digital platforms to enable organizations to continue to work in these very interesting times and going forward is exactly one of the reasons why we were glad to get it out as when we did.
One of the other things that I just mentioned is that whilst I've talked about the iterative process from start to finish, it doesn't necessarily have to function like that. When organizations feel confident that they have that plan and they have that ready, it might just be, pulling out the pieces that are helpful at that time. It doesn't have to be a huge, big, mammoth move, because we know that innovation doesn't work like that. So it is able to be as wealthy in knowledge and as quick as we need in terms of what works for that organization.
Yeah, and I think the benefit for me there, Kate, and the aspect that you just touched upon is just the sheer wealth of information that there is as long as people know what is it that you want, you can pretty much find the answers to it or a flavor to an answer of that on CAF, which is the beauty about it. I know later on in the session we'll sort of touch upon some of the newer announcements that were made when it comes to technical acceleration as well, which certainly has me quite excited from an open source community standpoint. And the bit that I know when we were talking about the webinar, the bit that very much got me excited was, if I was to look at sort of Contino's journey as in how we've evolved working with our clients initially just around the DevOps space, but then as cloud became more and more mature, so looking at one's sort of cloud adoption, the bit that I found quite interesting was the fact that just like Microsoft did, where you learned and took in all the feedback from what your customers were saying, we had a framework called Momentum, and that very much evolved in a similar fashion. And when we actually started talking about CAF and Momentum, it was incredible to sort of see how the methodologies were so similar, trying to achieve the same outcome for our clients. So if we look at, for instance, the CAF methodology, it's more than just the technology, right? It caters for more than just landing zones. It caters for your people side of things, your process side of things, your organizational transformation. And that's why one thing I always like to highlight is that CAF and Momentum is more than just technology, right? It's more than just the technology accelerators, which might be a significant underpinning of what you're trying to do, but you have to consider more than just what that is. And I guess just for the audience on the call, to give people a flavor of what Momentum is, Momentum was very much a framework that was born organically to help organizations meet their digital transformation goals on Azure, and it followed a very similar approach of multiple phases, which would be subject to your own maturity in-house, right? So you can look at these phases as a plan that you have to follow linearly if you really wanted to, or it could be something that you can pick and choose based on the phase at which you're in, given your internal maturity. So the idea being, if you're an organization who's never done cloud and are quite traditional with your way of adopting cloud technology, there's always a point where you have to start nurturing what cloud actually means to your business, right? And what are the problems that you're trying to solve, and educate your stakeholders around it. And then once you have that common ground, that common understanding, you move into a phase of planning, right? You move into a phase of looking at where your in-house maturity lies with regards to Azure and the core technology that you're trying to underpin, and also what is going to be your operating model and your approach to consuming Azure at scale, right? So it's making sure you plan enough, because if you plan to fail, you most likely will fail to execute, which then moves into very much the prove it phase, right? Which is where you're looking at early adopter projects that you would like to move on to Azure, but also building out that landing zone that gives you the ability to land your actual workloads and execute something that we call lighthouse projects, which we'll touch upon in a second. But the idea being, prove it is something that you can do in anywhere between 0 to 3 months, such that you can actually validate your business case, right? Because at every single point, you need to make sure you've got enough data points to be able to validate what is it that you're trying to do before you look at scaling your cloud adoption now within the organization. And a very common pattern that we see when we're looking to do the scale is building out something like a cloud center of excellence. It's now been done for a couple of years, so there are very good patterns out there on actually how is it that you should be looking to do that, which could help to foster large-scale application re-architecture, large-scale migrations, but also look to educate your internal teams using modern methodologies like hackathons, like Cloud Academy days, like dojos. And then going back to your point, Kay, is making sure you're always in a constant phase of iteration and evolution, right? You always have to continue to improve what you've done, because it's not a do it linearly and stop, but rather something that has to constantly be iterated upon and built upon. And for me, the best part was looking at the alignment that we had between Momentum and CAF, right? So on screen, you can very much see what CAF looks to do across the phases of define, plan, ready, and adopt. And obviously at the bottom, we've got govern and manage, and Momentum very much follows a similar thing, right? So that was something that really brought a smile to my face when we looked at actually the great alignment that we have, which obviously simplifies things, right? When we're speaking to customers, you're talking to Contino, you can speak to Microsoft, but actually we're trying to achieve the same thing for you here. And we talked about the notion of lighthouse projects, right? And lighthouse very much, and in Microsoft terminology, this is very much your Pathfinder projects, right? So instead of talking about just let's do cloud, how can we pick a problem statement, a use case, a workload, or an outcome that you're trying to deliver for your clients? And we basically call this the Goldilocks project. So it's something that's not too short, it's not too long, it's something that's not too large in scale, but not too small either, so as for it to be pretty much ignored. It's something that has the right level of sponsorship. It's not that critical when it comes to, say, either regulatory demands or the security pressures behind it, but enough so as to be able to demonstrate the cross-cutting concerns across the organization and be able to improve that in small chunks, right? So it's almost like take a small part of your organization, do that, learn from it, iterate upon it, and then look to scale, right? So safe to say, just like Goldilocks tried to do with porridge, we like to do with cloud and IT projects. So sort of moving on from that, the way in which momentum is done, we only see that being successful if we combine that with a completely modern set of working and different ways of working, right? So the way in which we as Contino like to deliver cloud adoption, let that be landing zones, let that be application refactoring, is in an approach where we actually upskill and deliver the outcome with our clients as opposed to for our clients. And frankly, if we look at the fact that if you want to build your own tech intensity, you have to build your own capability, the only way you can do that is by making sure your people are learning on a daily basis. So our approach is always to pair program and make sure our clients' people are learning from us. And at every single phase of our transformation, we like to make sure we're taking a metrics-based approach. So on day one, when we're looking to do something, let's say we want to rewrite an entire application, we look at some of the key metrics of what those applications are. It could be the net promoter score of your clients. It could be the SLIs and SLOs of the way in which that service is currently provided, and look to make sure at the end of the lighthouse, we can monitor what the incremental value has been delivered as an outcome of it, such that we can then reflect that back into the business case of cloud adoption and then look to scale that even more within the organization, because nothing speaks better on a business case than data, right? So that's the approach that we like taking when we're delivering a lighthouse project and something related to the cloud adoption framework. And in order to do that, we like to simplify it for our clients into what one could call a cloud adoption blueprint, right? So if we were to take all the aspects and all the guidance within CAF, you could primarily categorize it across these following 7 pillars, right? All the way at the bottom, you've got aspects related to your core of the cloud foundation, so more technical related, but also your cloud operations. So your cloud operating model, the team looking to support you to run your cloud platforms, and the key processes underpinning that. On top of those, once you're in a position where that's mature enough, you've got aspects around your developer experience. So how can you bring additional development teams onto that foundation while still respecting the operational processes and procedures that you have? How can you manage the demand coming into, say, perhaps your cloud center of excellence? The idea being all of this is working towards enhancing your customer experience and either simplifying or diversifying your product portfolio. So against each one of these core pillars, we've got detailed blueprints on how to achieve those. But as we sort of talked about, cloud adoption isn't just about these horizontal pillars of the organization. You also have some vertically speaking cross-cutting concerns. So for instance, the way in which a people and talent model works, that has to be fundamentally different. The way in which Matt talked about the conversations that he has with the CFOs, the way in which we talk about financial agility and the shift from CapEx to OpEx is fundamentally different. And that's where operating approaches like FinOps come into play, and also making sure the way in which you fundamentally think about security and controls has to be rethought, right? The number of times, safe to say for those who are practitioners, we've gone into a conversation where we're looking to retrofit traditional on-premise based security approaches onto cloud. It really doesn't work, right? And you can't just solve that in a tiny box in cloud foundations. That has to be sorted all the way out from the C-suite, making sure the CISOs are aware, making sure application teams are aware of what security means in the world of cloud, and reflect that into the core of the landing zone that you also look to build. So we won't go into in too much detail, but on slide, we've got sort of detailed technical and organizational blueprints that help you solve these challenges. And one of them that we'll talk about later today is in the aspects of cloud foundations. How do landing zones help you do exactly that? We talked about FinOps being another good approach on addressing financial agility, and there's more details on our CloudFest webinars around FinOps if one would like to go into more detail. And also making sure that, you know, the way in which a security posture is something that we'll tackle on later today is in the right way is something we've got some pretty good blueprints that we can talk to as well. So I'm going to pause there for a second and just walk people through around the fact that when you're looking to deliver cloud adoption within your organization, when you're looking to deliver a landing zone, when you're looking to do a cloud-based transformation within your company, we aren't just talking about one single use case. Fundamentally, the way in which engineering maturity works within your organization, you will have multiple different consumer types. And if we were to use Simon Watley's approach, you will have people who are so-called pioneers, people who are very much on the upper echelon of the maturity and skills of consuming cloud. And they also have some pretty complex use cases, right? Whereas on the other hand, right at the end, you've got people who are town planners, people who want to have a prescribed approach of consuming cloud. They're happy to consume something that's multi-tenanted. And then you'll have people who are somewhere in the middle, people who we can call settlers. And safe to say, your cloud operating model and your cloud adoption framework has to cater for all of these. If you just plan for one of them, you won't be catering to your entire organization. And the same goes if you just plan for town planners, you will most likely generate a sense of frustration for your pioneers who have some pretty bleeding edge use cases. So Matt, this is a challenge I personally have seen time and time again. What are your views on how sort of organizations can streamline innovation whilst managing control and governance at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, luckily I've been with Microsoft for about 3 years now. So before that, I was the customer, so I was going through this kind of pain and feeling of that. So I know exactly what it's like. For me, it is a management. It's about becoming multimodal. You are shifting from a very kind of SIAM-based kind of Prince 2 modeled, all that kind of great stuff that we spend lots of years putting frameworks around to try and safeguard service operational and availability to support the business. Now it's very much about a digital savvy business that wants to pioneer, wants to push the boundaries of that, wants to self-serve, wants to consume without abandon and kind of concern around financial control. So it is that creating a multimodal culture and bimodal culture within your organization, whilst at the same time maintaining that. The one thing I will always say is innovation isn't innovation unless you scale it in an industrial level. It's just an idea that you've kind of played around with as a toy. And also that innovation needs to erode your technology debt. So it needs to erode some of the legacy thinking or a legacy kind of capabilities that you've got within your organization. So think about that feedback loop and how it does that. Otherwise, you're just extending the technology debt and the capabilities and the issues that you've got within your organization. So it's really about a cultural shift, and that's the bit. The technology is the easy bit. It's always the people side. So how do you get people on board? How do you educate them? How do you upskill them? How do you get them past that fear of change? How do you give them autonomy and ownership? How do you take them through that journey? And you're not going to do that in overnight. We wish you could, but it's just not the reality of it. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes empathy, and it takes trust. People build trust over time when you apply empathy to them and their role and why it makes it happen. So yeah, I think that's probably my 10 pence.
Yeah, and I think that aspect that you just mentioned there, Matt, around the feedback loop, I think for me that's quite critical, right? So whilst you are catering for pioneers within the organization and you're perhaps giving them more freedom, it's not just making sure your cloud foundations and your operating model and your processes caters for those people, but also that you have that almost insourcing model of contribution happening, right? So if you've got your pioneers who worked on a bleeding edge use case, say how to use AKS with Cosmos DB at mass scale, right? You want to be able to take that pattern and then industrialize it. And that's where that contribution model really becomes quite powerful, right? Because you've got one side of the house who have the skills and the desire to trial out things that are quite bleeding edge, but then are also contributing that back to the business, which again is from a financial modeling standpoint, right? It's quite a big shift because one could argue that should be IP that you're now capitalizing on all that time and money that you spent, right, on building something that's so critical. And again, that's for me where this model becomes quite interesting. And actually, one of the things that we have just very recently done for those of you who want to is created a pretty detailed guide written by a fellow peer, David Dyke, around the ultimate guide to breaking to cloud native, right? And it kind of walks through how someone within an organization breaks from the prison of on-prem. So do go have a read. It's very insightful, and actually some of the stuff that David talks about in there is absolutely fantastic. I'd probably like to swiftly move on to the last bit of the section, right? So we talked about what is CAF, the why behind CAF, and from blueprint standpoint, how that works. But safe to say, cloud adoption isn't going to work if you haven't got the technical underpinnings in order to help you scale. And in order to do that, over the years, we worked a fair amount with our clients and also with Microsoft in making sure we have accelerators and blueprints to actually help kickstart one's Azure adoption and one's Azure journey. And they go all the way from technical blueprints through to organizational blueprints. So one of the key things we talked about in making sure you can consume Azure at a scalable and secure fashion is making sure you have a landing zone that actually works quite well. So we've actually got a couple of patterns in order to give organizations choice. Patterns that span all the way from Azure Cloud Native blueprints based on ARM. And Kate, I'll bounce back to you in a second. But also, we know that a lot of organizations out there do like using Terraform in order to build out their landing zone. So we work quite closely with Microsoft in aligning to how CAF Terraform modules work and build out a landing zone pattern using Azure DevOps and GitHub Enterprise in order to help provide you that foundation to deploy your workloads onto. But perhaps you might not want to do something that's quite heavy. You want to do something that's quite lightweight because you're just still experimenting with Azure, although you are in 2020, so you might want to think broader. For that, we've got patterns such as Azure Scaffold and Control Plane to help you adopt Azure at a much lighter and much smaller scale. But also make sure that you can integrate Azure with open source and third-party products that most likely you probably are already using on-prem or within different parts of the business. And the thing that has me most excited about some of these patterns is that actually Microsoft have made some significant investments recently onto one of them, and that was just announced yesterday, called Azure Enterprise Scale. So Kate, did you want to give us a brief 30-second summary of what that is and what can we look forward to in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. So only announced yesterday, so this is one of the first times that we're kind of talking about it. But enterprise scale is an architecture approach and a reference implementation that enables the effective construction and operationalization of landing zones. We know that landing zones have been a really, really key conversation this year. And what we've done is we've taken the architecture and given prescriptive guidance alongside our best practices, which gives the design principles for critical landing zone deployment. So helping organizations be able to utilize those in a quick, kind of an effective manner at scale rather than build each time. So that's a really quick summary, and you should kind of see a lot more information about this coming out and a lot more kind of tangible things that we can do with this. But I know a lot of our partners and us ourselves are incredibly excited about it.
Yeah, and I would say that the thing that has me most excited actually about Azure Enterprise Scale is that if we consider a landing zone, it's basically the way in which I tend to explain it. We're looking at primarily an airport, right? So the core of your landing zone is basically the runway, your flights being the actual applications that you're trying to land, and your shared services that you're trying to build out are basically the retail shops and additional offers that you want to offer out in your airport. So if you're a small organization, perhaps your shared services don't have to be that great and you can just use a smaller subset of those. And certainly that's where the Azure native services are quite critical. Whereas if you're a big organization spanning multiple countries, you might want to have a bigger airport, a bigger landing zone that caters for multiple shared services. And the great thing is, the work that we've been doing with Microsoft, working with a lot of the other organizations, globally, we have a pretty good pattern and sort of enhanced on top of the open source code base from Microsoft around how to consume Azure Enterprise Scale Landing Zone primarily using ARM and Azure policies. But on the flip side, we know not a lot of organizations want to just use ARM, but are also quite heavy users of Terraform. So for those organizations who are heavily invested within the Terraform space, we also have you covered, right? So there's a pattern that again uses all the CAF modules available on the Terraform public repository that Microsoft manages, and it looks to consume those and further drive additional governance in order to basically give you a hub and spoke model where your hub becomes the core of your airport that you're trying to manage, and the spokes are the Azure subscriptions that you give out for consuming teams to go and deploy their applications into. So we're extremely excited about the work that Microsoft's about to sort of publish out and how we can contribute towards that. But we also realize that that isn't enough. So, you know, a lot of organizations, once they've built a smaller landing zone, they want to scale it and they want to make sure that it's secure. So we've done a lot of work working with Microsoft, also with a lot of best-in-class third parties, spanning from Palo Alto's, from Microsoft themselves when it comes to Azure Sentinel, with HashiCorp and Vault, and with AquaSec and Twistlock, to almost give organizations a cloud-native security suite, such that these can integrate with either things like your CAF networking, your CAF logging and diagnostics, security center, etc., in making sure you have a very mature cloud native posture. Obviously, you don't have to adopt these on day one, but these are things that are almost modules that you can plug and play based on the kind of use cases that you have. So it could just be you don't have to use HashiCorp Vault. Azure Key Vault just meets all the requirements that you have, which case fantastic. It could just be that you don't need to use AquaSec and Twistlock. What comes in default within Security Center and Azure is fantastic and good enough for you. But if you are looking to add an additional functionality that isn't available, then at least you know you've got additional modules to enhance that with. And the same goes with Palo Alto and making sure you can integrate that with Azure Firewall in order to give you a centralized approach for network egress. And last but not the least, third-party and open source tools, right? We know open source within this space has a large role to play. So we've done a fair amount of work, you know, with Microsoft themselves, for instance, in building out secure AKS patterns, but also integrating the core Azure networking with things like Bind in making sure we've got a good approach to conditional forwarding and other third-party tools. So I'm conscious of time, but Matt, I'd love to get your thoughts on, you know, how you know, a lot of open source and third-party integrations are quite critical when it comes to enterprise adoption of cloud. You know, how do you see these integrations helping organizations further drive scale and adoption of Azure?
Absolutely pivotal. We kind of have a renewed policy, I think, in the sort of advent of Satya over the last 5 years, is that we want to be the engineering platform that lets everybody else be cool, right? Come as you are, do what you love in the way that you want to do it on our platform, and that openness and integration with, obviously we bought GitHub and we've doubled the size of that and kept the open source elements of that. From an open source perspective, I think we went past the point of more open source in Azure than non-open source 2 years ago. So, and our investment in that. It's pivotal to our openness and our heterogeneity across the entire industry and across the entire kind of both our industry but also our customers' industries. So it's absolutely key.
No, great to hear, Matt. And safe to say a lot of the work done, you know, with integrations with GitHub, the use of things like Packer as part of Azure Image Builder has actually been quite pivotal in making sure organizations can adopt it. But going back to sort of Kate's point and what CAF does look to do, we know that CAF is just more than just the technology aspects of it, right? So I'm conscious of the last 3 minutes that we do have left for the webinar, but what we do also have as part of the sort of Contino kit bag is making sure we give organizations organizational blueprints more around the process side of things and making sure you're adopting Azure in the right way. And the one that keeps me most excited is site reliability engineering, because I'm a big pioneer of SRE and how we could help implement that within organizations. But that also grows in making sure your operating model when it comes to finance and FinOps is done the right way, making sure you are programming and running things like chaos engineering and game days as part of your operational readiness. And, you know, hey, if you want to establish a cloud center of excellence, you can always count upon a partner like us to help you scale that. So I'll move on from SRE and organizational blueprints, but I will definitely leave you with one term that I do like to always throw out there, is the way in which we advocate SRE as part of Azure adoption is act like a developer, but you've got to continue thinking like a systems operator, right? Because reliability is always the key thing that you look out for. And last but not the least, from a people standpoint, we also know that people readiness is equally as critical as part of one's CAF adoption. So all the way from development and growth plans, using things like game days and dojos to train people up, running hackathons, virtual hacks that Microsoft themselves run, is all critical in making sure you have a well-rounded experience when it comes to CAF, right? Because at the end of the day, CAF is not just a technology platform, it's an experience that we want everyone to take away from. So with that being said, we've pretty much covered the bulk of the content, what is CAF and how, Contino can help you achieve that alongside the great guidance given by Microsoft. But if you'd like to know more on the slide, you've got more information around key resources that you can look out for. And one of the things that we are also happen to be running, and I am taking full credit for this, is something called an Azure CAF A chat. So if you'd like to speak to a fellow Azure SME within the world of CAF and cloud adoption, you can email us at hello@contino.io with that as the title, and someone from our team will get in touch with you if you'd like to talk a bit more about this. But before I sort of closed off, Matt and Kate, any final comments, takeaways, and closing remarks from your standpoint?
Just from my standpoint, it's definitely worth looking into cloud adoption framework for organizations. Like we said, there's something for everyone in terms of whether it's just needing help with a current project or thinking about it end to end. So I'd really encourage people to have a little bit of a look into it and land on some of the Microsoft documentation, but then also kind of our partners' documentation, because it's really strong.
So for me, just don't do this alone. We're here to help, but that's what we're here for. We'd love to support you on that journey, so and we can bring a full wealth of capability, both culturally, transition, and all of the learnings we've gone through with our other customers and ourselves as well. So learn from it and use that. Don't reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and I'd certainly like to echo both of what you've said, and actually, Kate, to your point, the documentation on the newly redesigned cloud adoption framework from the Microsoft portal is absolutely fantastic. And in the coming days, there will also be a Contino page that reflects a lot of that great content. So feel free to check those out. I'd highly recommend that. And if you'd like to continue to hear a lot of great content around all things cloud adoption, then do check out Contino's CloudFest website, as we have more and more content that's shared out there. But if not, thank you all for taking the time, and a special thank you, Matt and Kate, to both of you for such an insightful discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much for having us.
Cheers. Thank you.